All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack the really fascinating, often totally hidden logic behind how the world's most important cities actually get chosen. When we look at a map, it's so easy to just assume that the dots with the little stars next to them were picked simply because they're the biggest, or the wealthiest, or the most glamorous. But as we're going to see today, the real story is way more complicated. It's heavily guarded, and honestly, it's packed with enough intense political drama to rival a reality TV show.
So, quick question for you. What is the capital of Turkey? Seriously, think about it for a second. Okay, if you immediately thought of Istanbul, you've just fallen into what I like to call the biggest city fallacy. It is a classic trivia trap that confidently catches almost everyone. Istanbul is massive, it's incredibly historic, and it's universally famous, but it definitely doesn't hold the keys to the country. It's wild how often we do this. We constantly confuse a nation's most famous or populous city with its actual seat of government. Like, people just naturally assume Toronto is the capital of Canada, or that Sydney is the capital of Australia. We see this gorgeous, sprawling footage of Rio de Janeiro and assume, well, obviously it runs Brazil. We think of Auckland for New Zealand or Geneva for Switzerland. But in reality, the day-to-day business of running these nations quietly happens in Ottawa, Canberra, Brasilia, Wellington, and Bern. So why do we get this wrong so often? Basically, it's because we completely misunderstand how the rules of power have shifted over time.
To figure out why, we kind of have to rewind a bit. The word capital actually comes from the Latin term capitalis, which literally translates to the head or the top. Historically, ancient hubs like Damascus, Athens, and Rome naturally evolved into capitals because they were already the economic and trading heads of their empires. Damascus, for instance, was this bustling Middle Eastern hub of commerce way before it officially became the capital of the mighty Umayyad Caliphate. It was a perfectly logical progression, right? If you had the most people and the best port, boom, you were the capital. But the modern era completely flipped the script. Today, being the biggest isn't always a benefit anymore. Sometimes it's actually a massive political liability.
Which brings us perfectly to our first major theme, the art of compromise.
This strategy comes into play when bitter rivalries basically force a country to invent a brand new city from scratch just to keep everyone from tearing each other apart. Picture Australia right around the time of Federation. On one side, you have Sydney, the oldest, wealthiest, most established harbour city. On the other side, you have Melbourne, this booming, incredibly vibrant cultural and economic center. The jealousy between these two was absolutely intense. Crowning either one of them as the permanent capital would have instantly derailed the new federation. Neither side was ever going to bow down to the other.
The rivalry was so incredibly toxic that they literally had to write a 100-mile rule right into Section 125 of their constitution. It explicitly demanded that the new capital had to be in the state of New South Wales, but legally forced it to be at least 100 miles away from Sydney. This awkward geographic handshake completely blocked Sydney from taking the crown, and it led directly to the creation of the planned inland city of Canberra in 1908. It was designed to be the ultimate neutral ground, an entirely purpose-built administrative sanctuary.
And we see this exact same peacemaker playbook used up in Canada. Back in 1857, Queen Victoria broke a really bitter deadlock by choosing Ottawa, which, believe it or not, was a rough, gritty logging town at the time. But it was perfectly wedged right on the border between French and English Canada. Before that, the province of Canada had been wildly bouncing its capital around between cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City, desperately trying to balance the mostly English-speaking population of Ontario with the French-speaking population of Quebec. Ottawa was small, sure, but its location right on the Ottawa River dividing those two huge regions made it the absolute perfect diplomatic middle ground.
This whole idea of finding a middle ground sets the stage perfectly for the American story. George Washington himself utilized the 1790 Residence Act to essentially carve Washington, D.C. out of the South, specifically to appease warring northern and southern politicians. Placing the capital centrally along the Potomac River on land taken directly from Maryland and Virginia was a highly calculated move. It stopped northern abolitionists from securing total geographic control over the new government while keeping the pro-slavery southern states satisfied that they hadn't lost their political influence. It was a capital born purely out of political survival.
All right, moving on to our second big theme, strategic geography and security.
Because sometimes, picking a capital has absolutely nothing to do with appeasing your own citizens. It's about staying alive in a dangerous world. Whether it's King Philip II hiding out in the very center of the Iberian Peninsula, or Pakistan completely abandoning its coast to avoid naval attacks. moving inland is a classic geopolitical fortress strategy. In Spain, moving from Toledo to centrally located Madrid kept the royals safely buffered from foreign armies. Back in Canada, Ottawa was highly appealing for another reason. Toronto had literally been burned to the ground by American forces in 1813. Ottawa was safely tucked away from the border. And over in Pakistan, in 1967, they strategically abandoned the massive coastal city of Karachi for the inland shelter of Islamabad, specifically to eliminate the risk of an ocean-based invasion.
Now, if you want to see this geographic strategy taken to the absolute extreme, look at Brazil in 1960. They abandoned the overcrowded, vulnerable coast of Rio de Janeiro to carve the futuristic, centralized utopia of Brasilia straight out of the interior. Rio had history, it had stunning beauty, but it was suffering from severe social and economic problems, and its coastal position just wasn't doing any favors for developing the massive Brazilian interior. So, starting in 1956, they literally built Brasilia from scratch. It was a massive geographical pivot designed to physically pull the entire country's focus inward.
Finally, let's dive into our third theme, fresh starts and history. A capital city really tells a story about who a nation wants to be and how it views its own past. Remember that trivia question from the very beginning? Well, following the Turkish War of Independence in 1923, selecting Ankara wasn't just about military safety. It was a deliberate, powerful statement to completely break away from the heavy baggage of the Ottoman past. Istanbul was the grand historical seat of the old empire. By establishing the new capital in Ankara, the Republic was geographically declaring a fresh start, a modern, forward-looking era that was entirely separated from the imperial ghosts of Constantinople.
On the flip side, you have an ancient location like Beijing, which derives its immense legitimacy precisely from its staggering historical weight. We're talking about a city that has survived a dizzying array of names and dynasties across millennia. I mean, from the city of Ji, way back in the 11th century BC, to Yuzhou, then Fanyang, and Yanjing. When a city has anchored the power of a region for thousands of years, choosing it as your modern capital projects an aura of absolute permanence and undeniable authority.
But what happens when that history is incredibly painful? The tension between a safe, wealthy present and a heavy, historically significant past came to a head in Germany following reunification. It led to one of the most dramatic political showdowns in modern history. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany had a really tough choice to make. Stay in Bonn, which was the wealthy, comfortable, provisional capital of West Germany, super close to European allies, or move back to Berlin, the historic, complex heart of the nation that carried the immense baggage of the Nazi era and happened to sit in a pretty depressed economic region.
It all came down to one marathon session. After more than 10 grueling hours of debate on June 20, 1991, the German Bundestag voted to move the government back to Berlin by a razor-thin margin of just 338 to 320. It really proved just how incredibly contentious these geographic shifts can be. Older legislators, remembering Berlin's past glory, generally favored the move, while the younger members actually preferred the safe, modern integration of Bonn. The Eastern German legislators ultimately tipped the scales. But this single number, 338, perfectly captures just how deeply intertwined a capital city is with a nation's very soul.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Basically, a capital is rarely just a country's biggest population center. It's a carefully engineered symbol of compromise, of security, and of national identity. It is an idea manifested in concrete, government buildings, and very carefully drawn borders. From the intentional neutrality of Canberra and Ottawa, to the inland fortresses of Madrid and Islamabad, all the way to the symbolic rebirths of Ankara and Berlin, capitals are uniquely designed to solve national problems.
It really makes you wonder, right? How might your own nation's history have played out differently if a different map had been drawn? So, I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder today. If your country had to pick a brand new capital today, navigating all of your modern rivalries, your security concerns, and your cultural divides, where would it be? Thanks for exploring this with me today.